Lesson 12, learning to use shutter priority mode. Shutter priority is similar to aperture priority, but in this mode, you control the shutter speed and the camera controls the aperture setting. Shutter priority is most commonly used with moving subjects because this allows you to manage the shutter speed in relation to the speed of your subject. When you want to freeze your subject, you can choose a faster shutter speed, or if you want to let your subject blur, you can choose a slower shutter speed. The shutter in your camera is different than the shutter in a phone. In a phone, it's electronic. In a camera, it's mechanical. It consists of two curtains that open and close to regulate how long the sensor is exposed to light for. When the shutter is closed, it blocks the light from entering the camera. When you press the shutter release button, the first curtain will open, exposing the sensor to light, and then the second curtain will close. That duration is controlled by the shutter speed setting, and this is measured in fractions of seconds, or sometimes longer. The fastest shutter speed lets in the least amount of light, and on most cameras this will be around 1/4000th of a second. The slowest shutter speed on cameras is usually around 30 seconds, although some cameras do have slower settings. Extreme shutter speeds, very fast or very slow, are not so commonly used. Generally, you'll be using between, say, 500th of a second and 1/60th of a second to take your photos. Choosing a shutter speed that's too slow can create two types of blurring. This is motion blur and camera shake. Camera shake happens when you're hand holding your camera and use a slow shutter speed, and the camera moves even slightly during the time that the shutter is open for. This causes the whole image to be blurred. The slowest shutter speed you can use depends on how steadily you can hold your camera and how good the image stabilization on your camera and lens is. This does vary from camera to camera. If a camera has no image stabilization, or if it's not turned on, most people find it challenging to get a sharp photo when they're hand holding at shutter speeds below 1/30th of a second. Photographing a moving subject and using a slow shutter speed can cause your subject to be blurred. How much blur occurs depends on the shutter speed and the speed of the subject. People who like to photograph sports or birds or other moving subjects generally have their camera set on shutter priority mode. This mode allows them to choose a shutter speed that's fast enough to avoid their subjects blurring. I'll teach more about this in lessons 27 and 28. The speed that your subject is moving will help you determine the shutter speed that you want to use to avoid blurring. Photographing a person walking, for example, will not require such a fast shutter speed as photographing, say, motor racing or a bird in flight to get sharp photos. The faster your subject is moving, the faster you need to set your shutter speed so that it freezes the action. Lesson 12, practical exercise, learning to use shutter priority mode. In this exercise, you'll practice using shutter priority mode to photograph both static and moving subjects. Start photographing a static subject with your ISO set to 400 and your shutter speed set to 1/1000th of a second, and take some photos. Then halve your shutter speed, so that'll be down to 1/500th of a second, and take another photo, and then do this continually, halving your shutter speed until you get down to about 1/4 of a second, or if you know your camera's got good image stabilization, go even slower than this. Don't use a tripod, just hand hold your camera for these ones. That was down to about half a second, and my lens only goes down to f16 on the aperture, so they're a little bit overexposed. So you may need to readjust your ISO to a lower setting as well. So I'll take mine down to 100 and take those last couple again. So that's 1/8 of a second, 1/4 of a second, in half a second. I'm sure that will be blurry because my hands aren't that steady. Then repeat the process, reset your shutter speed back to 1,000th of a second at 400 ISO, and take some photos of a moving subject. I'm going to use the same subject that I photographed the first time, but you can do anything, any subject you like. When you photograph your moving subjects, it would be good to put your camera on a tripod so that it doesn't move, or on a firm surface, so that when you get down to those slower shutter speeds, your camera's not going to move and cause camera shake. If you're able to, repeat the process photographing a faster moving subject, starting at 1,000th of a second again, and then halving your shutter speed each time you take a photo. You might want to set your camera to burst mode for this, so you take a series of exposures all at the same time. Be observant of what your settings are, both your shutter speed and your aperture setting as you're taking these photos. And don't forget to make some notes about what you're doing and what you're observing. Then as you open your photos on your computer, zoom into each of them at 100% and look at the details. Are your photos sharp? If they're not, think about why they're not sharp. Is it because your camera moved, or is it because your subject was moving? The main points from this lesson are: shutter priority gives you control over the shutter speed. Choosing a shutter speed that is too slow can cause problems with movement. The speed your subject is moving will determine how you set your shutter speed. Practice this to improve your photography. Check the aperture setting when you're taking photos using shutter priority to make sure it's okay.